Welcome to Ideas in Action, a television series about ideas and their consequences. I'm Jim Glassman. This week, we continue part 2 of a discussion on boosting job growth at home. You might be surprised that the recession has been declared officially over because for many Americans, it sure doesn't feel that way. That's because the unemployment rate has been holding steady at nearly 10%. So where are the jobs? Here are 3 economists with very different views. Heather Boushey, a senior economist at the Center for American Progress, where she focuses on job creation and employment.
This is the best time for government to go out and spend its dollars effectively on infrastructure.
Kevin Hassett, senior fellow and director of economic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute and a former senior economist at the Federal Reserve.
We need to consider policies that could, on average, deliver something like 1% a year of growth for a long, long time, not something that would necessarily jack up growth just this year. A leading candidate, I believe, is fundamental tax reform.
And Alan Tunnelson, research fellow with the U.S. Business and Industry Council, a national business organization that represents nearly 2,000 domestic American companies.
What is urgently needed in order to grow while cutting debts is substituting, on a very significant scale, what we make at home, goods and services, for what we presently import.
The topic this week, getting America back to work. This is Ideas in Action.
Funding for Ideas in Action is provided by Investors Business Daily. Every stock market cycle is led by America's never-ending stream of innovative new companies and inventions. Investors Business Daily helps investors find these new leaders as they emerge. More information is available at investors.com.
According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the recession has been over since June 2009. That's when the economy finally showed signs of expansion. But for many Americans, this so-called recovery is no recovery at all. Unemployment hasn't gone down. It's been holding steady at nearly 10% for a year and a half. That means 15 million Americans are out of work. About 1/3 of those unemployed haven't had a job in more than a year, a phenomenon not seen since the Great Depression. Alan, let's talk trade. You're in favor of putting up barriers to encourage manufacturing and, as you put it, protect American jobs. But some people would say that the Smoot-Hawley tariff during the Great Depression actually exacerbated things at that time. So why would you want to have barriers now?
Well, the problem really is that, first of all, the Great Depression resulted fundamentally from the fact that the world economy heading out of the 1920s was so sick that it was headed for an enormous fall. And there's a lot of scholarly evidence showing that if you look at what tariffs were actually put on, when they were imposed, what specific retaliation, it's really much ado about very little.
But whatever happened
Jim,
in the 30s,
sorry,
you can imagine
right?
the United States said, we don't want any more Chinese goods, or we're going to force the Chinese to revalue their currency. The Chinese can come back and do the same thing to us.
In the crudest possible sense, in that case, we win. Why? Because they ran a $235 billion trade surplus with us last year in goods. And P.S., 95% of that was manufacturing, and P.P.S., a shrinking share of those manufactured goods were not shoes and toys and sporting goods and all the stuff that, for better or worse, is gone. It was much higher value, capital-intensive and technology-intensive
and a lot of that
products.
was we took it and we made things with it, right?
If you're talking about the net effects, if by some wild chance, which is not going to happen because nobody can possibly shut borders, that's just silly. But if there is a, quote, trade war, unquote, they're the enormous losers. They're running the biggest surpluses. So any country that had shrewd poker players as its leaders, and I don't think we do, would recognize the enormous leverage we have to secure more equitable terms of trade.
Kevin wants to get in here.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I really disagree. And I think that the analysis might be correct in terms of jobs, only jobs. But it's certainly not correct in terms of welfare. And so the fact is that, if you go to Walmart, you buy cheap stuff. Jason Furman has a famous paper about how Walmart's really great for low and middle income people and it improves their standard of living. If all of a sudden we say those cheaper goods from abroad are not allowed to come in, then we probably would create more jobs in the U.S. Because the stuff would have to be purchased from the U.S. But I would just dispute that it's clear that we would make the U.S. a better place. That I think the consumers would be a lot worse off, the people who are hired would be better off, and on net, probably, at least if you believe the trade models, we'd be a lot worse off.
But the consumers usually the people who are being hired.
Let's say we had no trade with anybody. We did everything.
Why would you start with that? Would that be the best? Why would you start with that? Why? That's so far from where we are. Why in the world? That's just not a thought experiment.
But that seems to be your thesis. Is
why do you
we
say
need
that?
to make more things in the United States?
Absolutely.
Why don't we make everything in the United States?
I don't see, first of all, why this country should not be fully competitive in capital-intensive and technology-intensive products. We have the human capital. We have this wonderful entrepreneurial system. We have a world-class university system. We have very skilled workers, despite what you read about the lousy schools, et cetera. In fact, lots of the folks losing their jobs to foreign competition nowadays are folks who have got PhDs. They're engineers, they're software programmers, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, tremendous amount of skills that we have in this country. Yet, what happened according to the latest trade figures that we just saw? The trade deficit in high-tech goods hit a new record, a new monthly record. The trade deficit in high-tech goods this year, as opposed to last year so far, is running 52% higher. This makes no sense if there were genuinely free competition.
Well, and I think something to add to that is that I think sometimes we discount the important role that manufacturing plays in a feedback loop through creating the high-tech goods and services. That those workers on the shop floor are the ones that can tell you, how this good is being produced.
Heather, so what is the policy? What policy would you like to see? Do you think we should, have tougher anti-dumping laws? Should we raise tariffs? How do you increase consumption in the United States but don't increase imports?
Well, I think one path that folks have been talking about a lot here in Washington that we should pursue is to take it to a little different place, to make that connection that folks have been making between energy and manufacturing. That we have this opportunity to create a viable industry here in the United States, to promote the development of green energy technologies and all of this. And these are things that other countries right now are starting to outpace us in.
This is a little tiny part of the economy.
But it doesn't have to be, and it could create a lot of innovation.
What do you think of that, Kevin?
No. Look, what we need to do is cut the corporate rate so that people want to locate firms here. The fact is that a big reason why the estimates in the literature are that the elasticity or responsiveness of the location decision to tax rates is really, really high, way bigger than one. So that if we lower the rate, then the plants that currently are deciding to locate in offshore low-tax places will want to locate here, and you'll create jobs here.
Hold on. What do you think of that? That seems to be like the most obvious thing to do. We have the second highest corporate tax rate in the world, a little tiny bit less than Japan.
Here's the problem with that.
European countries have lower tax rates.
Here's the problem with that, okay? Yeah. First of all, taxes, whenever you face a problem this big, there's never one magic bullet, okay? But the bigger problem is the fact that if you look at where the factories and labs are relocating to, it's not to the other OECD countries with whom
meaning highly developed,
the wealthier countries, right, with whom these comparisons are always made. They're going to very low wage, very low cost, regulation-free, for all intents and purposes, developing countries. Now, do we really want to engage in a tax competition with the Chinese? Because that, I guarantee you, is a formula for racing to the bottom and achieving Chinese living standards.
What do you think?
No, we absolutely have to engage in the competition. Everybody else is, and we haven't. And that's why this, even as you say, even the research is going abroad to these. In developing countries, the tax rates are even lower than in the OECD. And the point is that you have to locate. This is like a weird thing about tax planning that our viewers might not know, but you have to locate intellectual property in the tax haven in order to locate income there. Because what happens is you create the really cool software in some low tax country somewhere, and then all of your subsidiaries in the US have to pay royalties to the place where the cool software was developed. And so you need your smartest people that are generating the things that plausibly could charge royalties in the lowest tax place. And so we're really shooting ourselves in the foot. We're locating production offshore, and we're locating the research and development that then leads to waves of new products and so on offshore.
But you also locate the new lab or factory, or you transfer it where the subsidies are most lavish, where currency gets manipulated massively,
Alan,
in violation of every free market norm you can think of.
Well, I don't know. I mean, they're all. Nobody likes subsidies. Actually, I want to sort of segue from here because Kevin's talking about, basically talking about sort of the good jobs. But what do you think, Alan? I mean, doesn't it stand to reason that America's comparative advantage, whatever happens with trade, is in high technology or is in kind of the brainy kinds of stuff? And so that it's really become more and more of an imperative for people to get a better education. Isn't that really what the problem is?
No, it's not. And the reason is that we are not the only people, to put it bluntly, we are not the only country that recognizes the value of retraining and re-education and scholarship and knowledge. We are not the only country recognizing that knowledge is good. And the rest of the world, including the very low-income countries, are also racing frantically to reskill.
So what's our comparative advantage? Or do you believe in that?
That is actually increasingly a darn good question, and here's why.
That's why I asked it.
And this is the first time this has ever been said on national television. Productivity is increasingly becoming a mobile factor of production. All of the expertise, all of the special qualities that are involved in making advanced products can now be literally packaged by corporations and transferred overseas, almost as turnkey operations, to workforces that are low wage, not because in a sense they always have been and so they are basically playing catch up, but because they are so numerous, there is such a glut of labor that they're going to be low wage for decades to come.
So what does that mean for Americans thinking about what kind of job they're going to have in the next 10 years?
As long as this economy remains as open as it has been to this kind of ultra-low wage, regulation-free competition, I see a very dim future for even very skilled American workers.
Kevin?
I think that the future could be bright or it could be dim. I don't think that competition subtracts from what the U.S. can accomplish. Don't forget that what's going on is that we're seeing what growth theorists call convergence. That it used to be that the United States was much bigger, much wealthier than the rest of the world, in part because the rest of the world was, organized by communists that didn't know, that thought they could centrally plan an economy and they couldn't. And what we're seeing is, you say, why is China growing so fast? Well, they're growing so fast because they're so poor. And if they just copy developed nations, then they can start to grow quickly.
But they're not copying developed nations.
But we're in a period, yes, they are. We're in a period, yes, they are. They're using developed nations production. And as they converge.
I thought that's what you just said. I thought you said that anybody can that sort of brain work is mobile.
On that
microeconomic
level, but in terms of that macroeconomic policy, the state-owned sector in China is expanding once again.
Well, okay, but
that wasn't my point. My point was just that convergence. If China grows wealthy, that's not bad for us. That's good for us. The whole world economy gets bigger, and then we can sell them stuff too.
Actually, that's a great point. I wonder what Alan would think about that. Is this a zero-sum game? Gee, the Chinese are getting all rich, and so that means that we're going to be poor. Or if the Chinese get rich, or forget about the Chinese, because that's kind of an emotional issue. The Brazilians, for example. I just came back from Peru. Mm-hmm. It's amazing what's going on in Peru. You think the Peruvians are stealing all our ideas and thereby stealing our jobs? Or do you think it's good because Peru is getting richer?
It's a very complicated game. And one thing that strikes me is that for 15 years, this country has been told if we open up these so-called emerging markets, if we unlock all the consumption power of these zillions of consumers in China or outside China, everybody grows richer, the pie expands, the sky's the limit. And yet, what are we looking at now? What is Mr. Bernanke most worried about now? deflation. Why is that? Because, in fact, the opening of these very low-wage, low-consumption economies, which will remain low-consumption economies, relatively speaking, for decades to come, has unleashed much more production and much more productive capacity than it has consumption and consumption capacity. There's too much production in the
you
world
raised some really
that has
interesting
been
questions.
generated for these countries.
First of all, is the deflation that the Fed is worried about, is that the result of this new supply coming on board in all these countries, or is it because of this recession that we've just had?
Well, I tend to think of it as because of the recession that we're living through, but I mean, Ellen raises an interesting point.
And by the way, second question, I'll ask you, but I think Alan raises it, and it's a very important question, which is, yes, it is true that these countries are not doing a lot of consuming, but don't you think that at some point the Peruvians and the Chinese and the Brazilians will in fact be doing a whole lot of consuming like Americans have, or is there something culturally different about them?
Well, there was something culturally different about Americans over the past couple of decades, right? As we saw the American labor force see a decline, a secular decline in their wages, declines in family incomes. You saw them put more family members into the household during the 1980s. More women went to work to sort of make up for falling male wages. And then when they tapped out on that, they started taking out all this debt, all of the crazy new debt instruments that we now know can collapse an economy faster than you can say lickety-split in the late 2000s, right? Late 2010, at the end of the last decade. But what we, so your question about whether or not developing countries will start consuming is, will they develop the kind of middle class that can support that consumption base? What we've seen here in the United States is that it appears that we have allowed our middle class to atrophy over the past 20 years, 30 years, a lot of it because we haven't focused on creating good jobs for the millions of people who are not just high-tech workers and creating wage growth for those folks. And that in turn has led to, both, is a part and parcel of this crisis, but is also part and parcel of how we can't get out of it because folks don't have the savings, they don't have, now with high unemployment, and they don't have the equity in their homes to sort of be the consumers that we kind of
But do they not have the savings because somehow, I don't know, we've destroyed the middle class, as you say, or is it because of this cultural reason that you were just bringing up, that Americans have kind of gone a little bit overboard on their borrowing, now they got to cut back?
Well, but my point was, why did people do that, right? What you saw was declining living standards since the mid-1970s.
Actually, Kevin, respond to that. What about declining living standards? I mean, a lot of people have said that, and you've got, you've got two people working, a husband and wife working, and that wasn't true back in the good old 1950s. I mean, are living standards declining? Is there something wrong with the American system?
The data that suggests that come from wage data sets. If you look at consumption, it's not true that consumption has been declining, although after the recession, I would guess we would adjust it. No, but my point is the living standard is what people consume. No, and when the savings rate is 10% and it goes to 1%, then it could be because people are optimistic. It turns out, they were incorrectly optimistic. It could also be something that comes about because so many families have two earners, and so you don't necessarily have to save for the probability that there's no job in the family quite so much. And so there have been a number of changes that have led to increased consumption. I would guess if we ran the numbers through 2009 that we'd see that even real consumption in the bottom of the income distribution has declined now. But I think that we need to emphasize, though, that this notion that it's a zero-sum game, I think, is one that we should sort of reject. The fact is that there are problems in the U.S., and one problem is that you don't want to locate stuff that makes money here in the U.S. because we tax it so much. And that the idea that we could tax the heck out of firms if they're successful, but give them a little bit of a subsidy to do something if they can put green in the title of it, is just ludicrous policymaking, and that's been the policymaking that we've seen, through both the Bush and the Obama administrations. So President Bush didn't propose taking part in the tax competition around the world. President Obama hasn't proposed it yet, and I think that it's time that we fix those things, and then the jobs and the welfare and everything will start to come here.
But President Bush did cut marginal tax rates on income, and you don't personal income. So you don't think that has a good effect?
It's a very
you think
loose
cutting
link.
corporate taxes is more important? Would you accept a trade-off where personal tax rates go back to where they were prior to 2001, but the corporate tax is cut in half? There's the deal.
you know, it's a deal that you'd have to take seriously. I mean, the corporate tax is so out of whack with the rest of the world right now. You know, I'd almost be willing, but not quite, to trade my dog for a cut in the corporate tax rate or something.
Okay, Kevin brings up an issue that I'd like to explore here as we near the end, and that is this business about optimism. And, you know, one of the reasons that people borrow is because they feel good about the future. I mean, you know, we can have sort of moral judgments about people over borrowing. They feel good about the future. And so do you think that Americans feel today that the future for their children and their grandchildren is not going to be as good as the present is for them, or the past has been for them? I mean, are we entering kind of a new era here?
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, one, I think a lot of people were borrowing over the 2000s because maybe some folks were borrowing because of optimism, but all of them were doing it in order just to sort of keep up, to keep up with the living standards that their parents had, that they felt that they should have. So there are a couple of reasons that people borrow, and it's not just because they have hope in the future. That's usually why you invest. You invest in your kids' college education because you're hopeful that they'll get that job and that they will rise up. You know, are people more or less optimistic about the future today? I mean, I think that now people are very concerned. They're very concerned about wages, they're concerned about jobs, they're concerned about sort of where we're headed in this economy moving forward. But I also want to circle back to something that Kevin just pointed out, which is that, you know, we have these choices to make as a country about how we're going to spend the resources that we have, and how we're going to create a vision of America moving forward. And one of the big choices that we are looking at is you know, how we feel about taxes and the tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, and how we feel about investing in infrastructure and bringing our infrastructure system up to the 21st century, how we feel about creating an economy that works for all of us and creates a vibrant middle class. And I think those are really important questions. One of the things that although I agree with much of what you've said today, Kevin, one of the things that concerns me is that if our sole goal is on cutting taxes and cutting spending, although you didn't talk so much about cutting spending, but cutting taxes, how are we going to create the foundations for a strong economy? How are we going to lay that groundwork when we've got this infrastructure that's crumbling? I don't know that connection doesn't seem to be there.
Well, not to speak for Kevin, but I think that you would probably say, I would say, that cutting taxes is a way to spur growth. I mean, you can argue against that, but the goal is not, I don't think the goal is to cut taxes. The goal is to get the American economy going so that more people have jobs.
Well, and that's,
he thinks that that's the way to do it.
I think we all agree that we'd like to see more jobs, and I think that's, I mean, certainly we're all on that point. But what I think we've seen is that cutting taxes for the wealthiest Americans did not lead to rapid job creation over the 2000s. And you know, and as Kevin just said, I'm not sure that that's the right policy moving forward. Corporate taxes is a different story, but what you do in terms of income taxes does
so
not.
So you would cut corporate taxes?
I did not say we cut corporate taxes.
You said it's a different
I said
story.
It's a different story.
Meaning
that
real quick.
That you know. The biggest, I think the question on the table right now is what do we do about income taxes? And
you seem to be ducking it. Okay, but Alan, so what do you think about the future? The very eloquent remarks here by Heather about the way people see the future. Is the future dimmer for children and grandchildren?
I have to say I'm pretty pessimistic, and I'm pessimistic not only because we're in a deleveraging recession, which is going to take a long time to dig out of. I'm pessimistic because for much longer than that, for the entire previous decade, this country, it seems, forgot how to grow without piling on debt. We make a big mistake when we look at the pre-2007 period, the pre-2007 expansion as a reasonably good expansion. The economy was basically healthy. What did we hear from every responsible Washington official when the subprime mortgage crisis first broke? The fundamentals are healthy. The fundamentals then were deeply sick. How do we know this? Because even during that previous mortgage mess decade, the government was also pouring record amounts of peacetime stimulus into the economy. Record low interest rates.
Early in the 2000s.
Absolutely, and it continued well after the 2001-2002 recession ended.
Well, that may have been just bad monetary policy,
but also then bad budget policy. But the main point is stimulus of various kinds, and the growth output, the growth record, was totally mediocre. So that gave us a big clue that the engines of wealth creation were malfunctioning even back then.
Kevin, what about the future?
I think that right now, if we do nothing, then the future is looking bad for a long time. I think we need to remember that the experience of countries that have been through financial crises in the past is really troubling and disturbing. If you go back to late 70s Spain, they had really low unemployment before their financial crisis. It's never gone back to where it was, even through today. And so there's a chance that we're going to dislodge people from the workforce and that they're going to be out there for 30, 40 years creating a place that's a different country, a fundamentally different country. But I think that, as we talked about, there are a lot of policies that we can either agree on or almost get Heather to agree on that could change things. And I believe that they could change things a lot for the better. And so I think that the risks are kind of actually, as we look forward, on the upside. Because, put it this way, I think that you could go into any random corner of economic policy and change something randomly, and it would be better. It would probably be better because our policies are so terrible. And so, it's if Congress can act at all, then they can make things better.
Well, on that happy note, thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Heather. And thank you, Alan. Before we go, I want to remind viewers that you can catch Ideas in Action whenever and wherever you choose. To watch complete shows, just go to our website, ideasinactiontv.com, or download a podcast from the iTunes Store. And that's it for this week's Ideas in Action. I'm Jim Glassman. Thanks for watching.
For more information, visit us at ideasinactiontv.com. Funding for Ideas in Action is provided by Investors Business Daily. Every stock market cycle is led by America's never-ending stream of innovative new companies and inventions. Investors Business Daily helps investors find these new leaders as they emerge. More information is available at investors.com. This program is a production of Grace Creek Media and the George W. Bush Institute, which are solely responsible for its content.